main reasons I haven't made any programs for a few days, and because, well, basically these programs seem to be getting more and more sporadic, don't they? Well, one of the reasons for me doing this is just because there isn't much news at the moment. So I was looking for a topic for today's program, and I thought, let's have a look at opinion polls. There's an old saying that there are lies, damned lies, and statistics, but I think that should be adjusted to include British opinion polls. Lies, damned lies, and British opinion polls. Now, if you've been watching the publication of British opinion polls in British newspapers over the last few days, you may have noticed that there has been what appears to be an alarming loss of support for the SNP and a big swing to support for the Labour Party in Scotland. And you might be wondering why that is. Well, maybe you're not. Maybe you're thinking, well, the SNP brought this all on themselves. Perhaps. Okay, but let's leave that aside for the moment. But let's look at what these opinion polls are actually for. Opinion polls published, usually in Tory newspapers, are specifically created to give the impression that those newspapers want you to think is the truth. Now, I don't know of anyone in my massive circle of friends who has ever told me that they were approached by a United Kingdom opinion polling company like YouGov or any other for that matter for their opinion on who they're going to vote for in a general election, for example, or whether they support independence or not. And that, I think, is an indication that, at least in my mind anyway, although this is anecdotal, it's not scientific, that there's a perception, certainly amongst independent supporters, that we are never asked their opinions in British opinion polls. And of course, if that's true, then there's a very good reason for that, and that is because they want the opinion polls to look as though support for the SNP has dropped. Clearly hasn't. And in fact, all the massaging of the figures that they've attempted to do over the last 5 years or so have simply proved that support for independence has actually gone up, and it's somewhere in the region of the low 50% mark. So contrast that with what they claim is happening with the SNP vote. And these polls have gradually been shifting more and more and more towards the Labour Party. They're now claiming that there is a 10% swing to the Labour Party, that the SNP vote has collapsed, and that people are now intending to switch their votes from the SNP to the Labour Party in multiple constituencies. And they show fancy graphics and maps and showing the changing colours of these constituencies. And that is if, and that's a huge if any of the stuff that they're saying is actually true. But we know from bitter experience that in the past there have been other polls very similar to this, and those of you with memories that go back past several general elections will know that they do this every single time there is a general election. They massage the figures to make it appear as though the SNP vote is collapsing. And this is designed specifically, this is what polls are for, is designed to make you think that you've already lost. That way you won't vote. And if you don't vote, or you vote for somebody else because you've been swayed by this nonsense, then the SNP vote does collapse, and of course that's what they want. So opinion polls, remember, are published by United Kingdom papers, which are owned by Tory donors, Tory sympathisers, and foreign right-wing billionaires. So they are not in favour of Scotland becoming independent. And of course, they will ask the pollsters to try to reflect this in their figures. And the pollsters say things like, well, they weighted the vote. Now, what the earth does that mean? That just simply means they have massaged the figures up and down until they get something which looks like what they want. Now, in the past, that would normally have been the SNP, or rather, I should say, the independence vote hovering around 50%, because that produces reasonable doubt, as they would say in a court of law. And the whole point of the polls is to create doubt in the opposition that you want rid of. The SNP has now been responding to these polls by making counter statements against the Labour Party. But the Labour Party, remember, is the British Labour Party in Scotland. And although they say that voting for the Labour Party means voting for a change, there certainly will be a change from the SNP, it's not the change that you want. It's a change to British control. And it's a change to nothing, really, because Sir Keir Starmer has turned the current Labour Party into a sort of purple version of the Labour Party, which is a mix of mainly Tory policies and a teeny weeny hint of promises of things to come, which would be, I suppose, teeny weeny bit socialist. But basically, the Labour Party is just promising more of the same. And so we end up in a situation where the people of Scotland get turned off voting for the SNP because they think they've already lost. Well, we know better than this. Now, I also noticed today that Alan Cumming, there's an interview being published in which he gave an interview actually in American television and explained why he still supports independence. And he also explained how the British Labour Party basically betrayed Scotland at the last moment, 3 days before the polls in 2014. During the period of purdah, this is the period in which the United Kingdom had agreed that they would not introduce any new policies, promises or pledges in that period. They broke that rule. That entire action of bringing in a new policy, the so-called vow, the so-called Devo Max promise that Gordon Brown made, was in fact breaking the rules of that referendum. That referendum should have been rerun without the vow, and yet it stood, and it caused people to vote no, because they thought they were going to get all these lovely powers, and we were going to have almost everything we wanted, except for foreign affairs and defence. And that so-called Devo Max is almost federalism according to what Gordon Brown was promising. But of course, it was a lie. It was a lie which broke the rules of that referendum under the terms of the so-called Edinburgh Agreement, which was signed by the United Kingdom government and the Scottish government at the time. They agreed there would be no new information introduced, and yet they introduced it, and they broke the rules. And the Electoral Commission said, oh, no foul, no problem at all, just carry on voting. So we know the whole thing was fixed because the rules were broken. It should have been null and void, should have been rerun, and yet it wasn't. So Alan Cumming is right. This vow was reneged upon almost immediately after they had got their so-called 55% no vote. The British Labour Party just forgot conveniently all about these extra powers. And when they were reminded about it, they watered it all down, tied it up in red tape, and it became just 5-10 years in the future, and it was going to be a lot less than they promised. Anyway, the upshot of all of this is that independent support in 2015, after that loss, shot up. And the SNP won a massive number of United Kingdom seats, 56 if I remember correctly. All but 3 of the main seats allocated to Scotland in the Westminster Parliament went to the SNP. And yet all of that ground was lost during the Sturgeon era. However, let's get back to the point here. Let's assume for the moment these polls are designed to make us all give up. And let's say they worked, and the SNP vote did collapse, and Labour swept in, took the majority of the seats in Westminster. What the hell difference would that make to anything? Well, actually, it wouldn't make any difference at all. The situation would be exactly the same. These Labour politicians, if they were elected, and this is a massive if, and I don't actually think it's going to happen, but if they did get elected, and it was a majority of seats, what would happen? Virtually nothing. The only thing that would happen is that the number of SNP MPs at Westminster would be smaller, and they would be laughed at in just the same way as they were when there were 56 of them, and they would still have no control over United Kingdom policy in Scotland. So nothing would change. The only thing that would change because of these polls is the voters' attitude to the SNP and independence, and that is the point of the polls, and that is the point of this United Kingdom election. It's to push down on the SNP, to reduce its support, so that when there is a real election, and I'm not talking a UK one here, when there's a real election in Holyrood, that the SNP gets a thrashing. And that's what this is all about. There have also been some other things in the news in the past few days. You may remember Alex Cole-Hamilton, the other member of the Liberal Democrat Party in Scotland, and I saw Greg Moody publish a piece today saying apparently there had been a conference of the Liberal Democrats, and he said, well, who knew? And I pointed out that if there was a conference of the Liberal Democrats, would that not just be a date, since the other member of the Liberal Democrats would be the only other person there? Anyway, Cole Hamilton's claiming, as usual, lying, that he can't get an emergency medical appointment in Scotland anywhere. It's ridiculous, it's terrible. The SNP has ruined the NHS. This is a blatant lie. I seem to remember he was talking about dental emergency appointments. And you can get a same-day dental appointment in an emergency if you're in pain in any NHS dentist practice anywhere in Scotland, any day of the week. I've done it myself several times. It's a complete lie. Cole Hamilton then went on to claim that he'd been subject to abuse. Well, no surprise there then, considering all the lies he's been telling. So now, because he doesn't have any influence, his party is pretty much invisible, and he has no way of making any kind of impact on the political scene, he's now decided that the best way of keeping his name in the papers is to claim that he's gone into therapy because of all this abuse. He's painting himself as a victim of abuse from people that he has lied to who are angry about it. So if you ever think about that for a moment, that's rather pathetic, isn't it? It's not as if he's got any policies or he's got anything positive to say, or even that he is in opposition to something. He's just simply saying, oh, poor me, these nasty people have been bullying me online and I have to go into therapy. Well, I think the rest of us should have to go into therapy after listening to the litany of lies that he's spewed for the last few years. The man is an irrelevance, and he will do anything to get his name in the papers. A bit like Anas Sarwar, really. Anyway, the upshot of this program today is I want you to go away from listening to this rant that I'm giving you today, thinking this. The opinion polls that you're seeing in the papers are basically lies. These are here to influence the way you vote, not now, but in the next general election at Holyrood. And they're here to make you feel like giving up. This is about inducing doubt. Once there is doubt, it's very easy to divide your opponent. Once you start doubting each other, you start fighting with each other, well, you know what happens. We all end up fighting with each other instead of actually uniting the fight against the common enemy. And this is how the United Kingdom has ruled so successfully in its empire for hundreds of years. And they're still using the same playbook, and we're still falling for the same tricks. So at the end of this program today, just remember one thing. Support for independence has gone up. It will keep going up, regardless of the fortunes of the SNP or any other political party. And the other thing that's important to remember at the moment is that we have to fight free ports. Quite apart from the fact that free ports basically are introducing a foreign country into Scotland, and they are essentially selling off assets owned by you and I and our local authorities to private, unaccountable multinational corporations so that they can do what they like with those buildings, those assets. Apart from that, I noticed an article today written by Kenny McCaskill in which he was pointing out that most of well, not most, but some of Scotland's ports are not owned even by the local authority or even by a Scottish company, but are owned by English companies or Canadian pension plans, pension funds. And these are being sold off. These entire areas, these ports have been sold off in a massive fire sale that the UK had some years ago, selling off publicly owned assets, airports, which we need because they're essential, because we have hundreds of islands and we have to be able to supply everybody. We need these ports. They should be in public ownership. If we lived in Europe, they would be in public ownership, but they're not. Even before the free ports have started, a lot of these ports are owned by companies outside of Scotland or investment managers in Canada, of all places. And their interest is not in boosting the economy of Scotland, it's not in investing in these ports, it's in getting a return for their pensioners. Well, okay, there's nothing wrong with that, but why don't they do that in their own country with their own ports? The Americans, incidentally, according to Kenny McCaskill, were approached by the same Canadian company, the same pension firm, to sell some of their ports to the Canadians, and they told them to do one. The Americans, despite all their free market neoliberal capitalism, know the value of publicly owned infrastructure like ports. These are essential to any country. You cannot and should not sell them off. So Scotland is in a pretty dire predicament at the moment. The only way to get back control of these ports is to take them back into public ownership. And the only way to do that is to be independent. And that means we cannot lose our support for independence. And if it means holding your nose and voting SNP at the next Holyrood elections, at least for the first vote, first past the post seats, and perhaps voting for another independence party in the list seats, then, as I've said many times before, if we get a majority of the votes, when you combine those two figures over the combined figures for the unionist parties, we have a majority for independence. And it's very simple. It would be done simply as a measure of support for independence. But the SNP would have to change. It would have to accept that in the second vote, people would be free to choose another independence party, because it's not going to be about seats, it's going to be about independence. The seats would still be won by pro-independence parties of one stripe or another, but that wouldn't matter. What would matter is where the votes go and how many pro-independence votes there are compared to unionist votes. And if we outnumber them, we have a majority for independence, we can declare it. In the background, Salvo is working on the legalities and the international acceptance of a vote like that by making sure that the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights, the European Council, etc., are made aware of the fact that the United Kingdom lied about Scotland's status in 1960 when the UN asked them what Scotland's political status was, and they said, oh, it's not a colony at all. No, it's in a voluntary union. Well, we know that's a lie. There was nothing voluntary about the 1707 Treaty of Union. It was forced on us virtually at gunpoint and with a naval blockade. Nobody got to vote on it, and the decision was made by a few dozen, if that. In fact, I don't think it was even that. It was a dozen and a bit nobles and wealthy merchants. And the only good thing they did was insist that the claim of right be one of the preconditions of the union, and that's the thing that guarantees that we still have our sovereignty, and most people forget this. But Sarah Salyers and her team at Salvo are working very hard to put the legal case together and all the historical papers that prove it, so the UN knows that Scotland is being treated as a colony by the United Kingdom. And we can then request decolonisation status, and that would mean that our vote for independence at any general election would be an expression of our self-determination. The problem with self-determination and its acceptance at the UN at the moment is the UK is claiming that we have used our right to self-determination in 1707, and that we used it again in 2014 to say no to independence, even though that was done after the rules were broken and a lie was told in order to get people to vote no. So there's a lot of work to go before we get to where we're intended. But at the same time, we mustn't be put off by polls. And that's really my message today. Polls are irrelevant. This United Kingdom general election is irrelevant. It is simply a PR stunt by the UK to make us feel like giving up. And none of us should do that. And I'm not going to do it, and I don't know anyone else who is going to do it. That's it from Inde-Car today. Hopefully I will see you again in the next few days, when maybe there'll be something more to report, something positive for a change. All right, that's it from me. Keep the faith as usual. Remember to share this video whenever you see it. I'm hoping that my editor Stevie will also be posting it on YouTube, on the Scottish Independence channel, alongside the two Davies, and you should see it later on. Please share it everywhere you can. Share the link with people on Facebook. Share the link on every other social medium you can find. The more people see this stuff, the better. Anyway, I'd like to thank the 20 of you who stuck with me to the end today. I know it's a small audience to begin with, but I know it will grow. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye for now.